The once thriving tilapia farms of Maoming now lie in eerie silence. Empty ponds stretch for miles, their waters stagnant, littered with floating carcasses. The scent of decay lingers in the humid air, where just 2 years ago, life bustled with the promise of prosperity. Farmers gather under a faded for sale sign, faces worn with despair. At its peak, Maoming exported over 100,000 tons of tilapia annually, enough to feed 25 million Americans. Today, its economy has flatlined. Factories shuttered, jobs erased, hope extinguished. How did the tilapia capital of China, once hailed as a model of rural revitalization, collapse into a ghost town? Was it just an unlucky downturn? Or was the entire system built on a ticking time bomb, waiting for the right pressure to blow it all apart? The answer, hidden behind closed doors, is more devastating than you think. The collapse did not happen overnight. It was a chain reaction, silent, methodical, inevitable. The first signs appeared early last year when hatcheries reported a sudden drop in orders. Farmers, once eager to stock their ponds, grew cautious. Some hatcheries shut down entirely, their tanks dry, their workers gone. By March, prices had plummeted. Fresh tilapia, once fetching nearly 80 cents per pound, now sold for a paltry 58 cents, barely covering feed and labor costs. The tilapia gold rush had turned into a slow, grinding death spiral. Inside Maoming's 16 massive processing plants, the silence was deafening. Machines designed to clean, fillet, and package thousands of tons of fish now stood idle. Workers, once proud to meet America's endless appetite for affordable seafood, faced layoffs with no clear prospects. If we keep farming, we lose more money, one plant manager quietly admitted. If we stop, we lose everything. The collapse rippled outward. Trucking companies, cold storage facilities, feed suppliers, all sectors tied to the tilapia supply chain began bleeding jobs. Tongwei Group, one of China's largest aquaculture firms, issued a grim warning. 1 in every 10 tilapia farmers nationwide could be wiped out by the end of the year. But Maoming's real vulnerability was not just bad luck. It was structural. For decades, Maoming built its fortune around one customer, the United States. Everything from hatchery practices to processing specifications was engineered to satisfy American standards. Boneless, skinless fillets, specific portion sizes, strict cold chain logistics, BAP and ASC certifications for supermarket shelves. The farmers of Maoming were locked into a single system, a supply chain trap designed for American appetites. And when that market faltered, there was no way out. By late April, Reuters reported that tilapia fry, the newborn fish meant to repopulate the ponds, sat unsold. Feed suppliers reported sales cut by half. Processing plants operated at less than 40% capacity. Panic set in. Farmers, facing mounting debts, quietly began draining their ponds, selling off what little fish remained at fire sale prices just to survive. The collapse of Maoming's tilapia industry wasn't just an economic event. It was the visible symptom of a deeper disease. Overdependence, lack of resilience, and the fatal assumption that the American market would never close its doors. But the door had slammed shut, and it wasn't by accident. It was the first domino in a much larger chain reaction engineered from across the Pacific. The tilapia ponds of Maoming are not just drying up. They are evaporating into history, taking with them a way of life, a fragile prosperity, and the illusion that China's export machine was invincible. The hammer came down hard, and it came from Washington. In early 2025, the United States imposed a staggering 170% punitive tariff on Chinese tilapia imports, covering an estimated $425 million in annual trade. Behind closed doors, trade officials described it as a precision strike, not just a tax, a weapon. The impact was immediate and brutal. For every $100 worth of tilapia shipped, importers had to pay an additional $170 at the port. Add shipping, insurance, handling fees, and suddenly a single container of fish cost nearly triple what it did before. Importers fled. Supermarkets canceled orders. Logistics companies withdrew. Maoming's lifeline, its only real export artery, was severed overnight. Farmers tried to hold out. They slashed prices. They bundled deals. They begged for local government aid. But nothing could compete with the avalanche of cost triggered by the tariffs. A product designed to be cheap, fresh, and fast had become overpriced, stagnant, and toxic to buyers. Inside meetings that never made the headlines, Chinese officials quietly admitted, "There is no fast solution." Sources close to the Maoming leadership described emergency plans to dump excess fish into domestic markets, to retool plants for other species, to court new buyers in Africa and the Middle East. But reality bit back. Domestically, China's consumers were strapped. 70% of household assets locked into crumbling real estate. No cash flow, no spending power. Americans loved boneless tilapia fillets. Chinese consumers preferred whole fish, live fish, different species altogether. Maoming's entire industry had been custom-built for an American palate that no longer wanted what they had to sell. "It's like we built a highway to nowhere," one processor lamented in a private forum. "We thought the road would always be open. Now it's blocked forever." And the hope of shifting exports elsewhere. More illusion. Europe demanded different certifications. African markets offered volume but not prices high enough to sustain massive Chinese industrial farming costs. The Middle East showed interest but sporadically and too little, too late. The supply chain trap had snapped shut. Maoming was locked in. No way out. No roundabout. No backdoor. Every path, every pivot, every emergency exit required investments Maoming didn't have, consumer demand China couldn't summon, and time the farmers no longer possessed. Meanwhile, Washington tightened the screws even further. In April 2025, a secondary tariff package added another 34% duty on a wide range of Chinese agricultural goods, including shrimp, crab, mushrooms, tea, and ginseng. A clear message: this wasn't an isolated strike. It was a full-spectrum economic containment strategy. The collapse of tilapia was just the opening salvo. What had begun as a local economic tragedy was spiraling into a national strategic defeat. Maoming's empty ponds are just the first cracks in a much bigger dam, and when that dam breaks, the flood won't stop at the shores of a single town. Inside Maoming's industrial parks, the chain reaction continued to unfold. Where once the steady hum of processing plants echoed through the humid air, now only silence remained. The 16 major tilapia factories that once fed America's hunger for cheap seafood had become mausoleums of failed promises. At the factory gates, stacks of empty pallets lay abandoned. Cooling units, designed to handle hundreds of tons of fresh fish daily, stood idle. Workers who once packed neatly trimmed fillets for Walmart and Costco now lined up at local labor offices, clutching pink slips and severance papers, if they were lucky enough to get any severance at all. Sources close to the local Chamber of Commerce quietly admitted that more than 60% of Maoming's seafood processing capacity had gone offline since the tariffs hit full force. Some businesses tried to pivot, switching to domestic sales or repurposing plants for other fish species. But the math simply didn't work. The margins were razor thin. Domestic consumers weren't buying. Everywhere you looked, the same story repeated. Trucking companies, dependent on a steady stream of cold shipments to southern ports, went bankrupt. Feed suppliers shut their doors. Ice manufacturing plants, once operating 24/7, now mothballed their equipment. The financial underpinnings shattered as well. Many factories had expanded aggressively during the boom years, fueled by cheap credit and the assumption of eternal demand from the United States. Loans backed by collateralized future exports, a system insiders now describe as building castles in the air, turned toxic overnight. Factory owners who once flaunted luxury cars and hosted banquets for local officials now scrambled to negotiate with banks, trying desperately to delay foreclosures. But the banks, themselves under pressure from a broader debt crisis in China's regional economies, showed no mercy. "There are no more lifelines," one former plant director said off record. "Everyone is drowning, and no one is throwing a rope." Meanwhile, the government tried to stage manage the collapse. State media ran glowing features about new opportunities in aquaculture innovation and domestic consumption upgrades. But behind closed doors, Local cadres quietly confessed that Maoming's collapse had triggered a fiscal crisis. Tax revenues plummeted. Public projects were frozen. Subsidies promised to farmers and small businesses went unpaid. Maoming's factory district, once a proud testament to China's rise as the world's manufacturing powerhouse, now stands as a chilling warning. When you build your future on a single market, a single customer, and a single assumption, the day that foundation cracks, everything above it comes crashing down. The tilapia factories were just the first to fall. More dominoes were already trembling on the edge. At the worker level, the devastation was even more immediate and visceral. For thousands of families in Maoming, the tilapia industry wasn't just a paycheck. It was their past, their present, their imagined future. Now all of it was gone. The layoffs swept through the city like a silent plague. One by one, the paycheck lifelines were cut. Some workers got a week's notice. Most received none. One former processing plant employee quietly admitted, "They told us to go home and wait. We're still waiting." Many who lost their jobs had no savings to fall back on. Years of stagnant wages and sky-high living costs had already stretched household finances thin. When the final paycheck dried up, so did the ability to pay rent, utility bills, even daily meals. A survey conducted by local NGOs, leaked through unofficial channels, painted a grim picture. Over 40% of displaced seafood workers reported being unable to meet basic living expenses within 60 days of losing their jobs. Food banks, a rarity in China's urban centers, sprouted up around Maoming. In the once bustling worker dormitories, rooms went dark. Entire complexes, built during the boom years, now stood half empty. Young workers, those under 30, faced a particularly cruel trap. Their skills, laser-focused on seafood processing or logistics, suddenly became worthless. Retraining programs promised by provincial officials were either underfunded or non-existent. Older workers fared worse. Discrimination based on age was rampant. Many quietly slipped back to their ancestral villages, nursing the humiliation of having been abandoned by a system they had helped build. The psychological toll was impossible to ignore. Local clinics reported a spike in cases of depression, anxiety disorders, and alcohol abuse. Domestic violence quietly rose. Suicides, rarely reported officially, ticked upward. And still, Beijing maintained the narrative that rural revitalization was succeeding. But on the ground, it was clear, the factories had fallen first. But it was the people who bore the deepest scars. The collapse in Maoming didn't stay confined to its dusty factory floors and abandoned ponds. It seeped outward, quietly corroding the very fabric of the local society and sending tremors across the global economic map. Within months, the city's local economy entered a death spiral. Businesses that depended on the spending power of seafood workers, cafes, grocery stores, small clinics, even primary schools, saw their revenues crater. Municipal budgets, heavily reliant on tax income from the seafood sector, evaporated. Maintenance budgets slashed. Public services thinned to a skeleton crew. Residents, already grappling with joblessness, now faced a collapsing civic environment. Petty crimes rose. Streetlights dimmed. Trash collected less often. It wasn't chaos yet, but the social fabric was fraying at the edges. And globally, the tremors grew. The United States' strategy of economic decoupling accelerated. New seafood supply chains formed across Southeast Asia and Latin America. American retailers vowed never to let themselves be vulnerable to Chinese supply disruptions again. Meanwhile, China's broader export model faltered. Shrimp farms in Hainan, tea plantations in Fujian, mushroom growers in Zhejiang, all faced the same slow strangulation that Maoming had suffered. Insider leaks from Beijing policy circles revealed growing panic. Official discussions shifted from diversifying exports to containing social unrest. There was no easy fix. The domestic consumer base was too indebted, too cautious. Inside Maoming, the conversation changed. No longer about ambition, no longer about prosperity. It became about survival. Which families had left town? Which streets were safe after dark? Which pawn shops still offered loans? The collapse wasn't just economic. It was human, and it was irreversible. Maoming, once a proud showcase, had become a cautionary tale, a brutal reminder that when you build a nation's future on fragile foundations, even a small crack can shatter everything. The story of Maoming is not an isolated tragedy. It's a flashing red warning, a glimpse into what happens when an empire built on fragile dependencies begins to crack. Factories closed, workers scattered, communities hollowed out. But the real collapse is just beginning. If one town could fall so fast, what happens when the chain reaction reaches the industrial heartlands of China, the cities no one dares to speak about yet? Behind closed doors, insiders are already admitting it. This is not a cycle. This is a shift. Will China adapt in time? Or are we witnessing the first tremors of a collapse far larger than anyone dares to imagine? The flood has breached the walls. Now, the question is, what else will be swept away?